All right, this is lesson 9, or excuse me, lecture 9 of an Envision 10 lectures on the IndiScript and the partial decipherment thereof. I'm Dr. Steve Bonta. And again, as I always say at the beginning of these lectures, if this is the first one you've clicked on, stop right now and go back and click on no later than lecture 3. The first 2 lectures in this series are kind of preliminary, and if you're already familiar with the IndiScript a little bit, with the history of decipherment and some of the issues associated with the discipline, as well as with the languages of South Asia and this kind of thing, then you can profitably skip the first 2 lectures in this series and jump right in to lecture 3. But you have to appreciate what's going on. You do have to watch these lectures in series because they build a case as well as explain a reproducible and falsifiable methodology. And it's more than could possibly be encompassed by a single lecture, unless someone would like to watch an 8 or 9 hour long nonstop discourse on the script. I don't think anyone wants to do that. So I've broken this down into 10 lectures, of which 8, lectures 3 through 10, are essentially the decipherment and its consequences, but they're done in sequence. And if you don't watch the earlier lectures first, you won't really understand what the premises are for later lectures and how we arrived at it. It will all seem very gratuitous. And in fact, so much of what passes for decipherment, and I don't say this disrespectfully, as I said in the very first lecture, and I'll say this again, none of this is to be construed as ridicule or anything of anyone else who has tried to decipher the script, whatever their results have been. It's a very, very, very difficult puzzle. And of course, the work that I've done, which has occupied more than 30 years, really 35 years at this point, is far from complete, although I don't know if my life is going to last long enough for me to do much more than I've done already. And so part of these lectures constitute not only a summary of my work so far, but also a heartfelt plea for younger people maybe to take up and continue, because there's much work left to be done. In any case, but to the extent that it's possible, it is important to show the reasoning behind the choices that I've made for the values that I'm claiming for these signs, and for some of the the names, and obviously the nature of the underlying language and all of that. All right, now the previous 2 lectures, lectures 7 and 8, were really detailed in terms of pointing out values for a lot of signs that we were able to derive, and it's far from exhaustive. If you look at my monograph on the script, there's a total of about 60 signs, give or take a few signs, that I assigned values to, and I don't want to cover them all in this lecture, but certainly the important ones. So we've kind of done that. And now in the 2 remaining lectures, this lecture I want to talk about a couple loose ends, namely the so-called terminal and juncture signs, and kind of talk about what I think they mean. In the case of the juncture signs, this is very tentative and may well be falsified by further work, or even my own work when I have the time or inclination to actually focus on those signs and try to look into them more deeply, which I admit I've not done. I've used them primarily as markers that demarcate different sign fields, and in particular, as we noted in the early lectures, demarcate transcriptive from notational writing fields. And so that in that sense, they do serve a critical and a pragmatic purpose in this particular decipherment. But beyond that, it still begs the question of what these signs may actually mean. Are they case endings, or are they something else? So we'll look at that, and then we'll talk about some of the terminal signs. And I think there we're on rather firmer ground, as you shall see. So without further blather on my part, let's jump right in. All right, so by the juncture signs, we mean these 3 signs. They look, the commonest is the one in the middle, the double tick sign. The single tick sign seems to be a little bit different from the other 2, but overall they do have a common function. The third one on the far right is maybe is less common than the double tick sign, but it is very significant and has a certain affinity for certain of the P signs, in particular the tong sign that we've ascribed the value vasu to, and also the crescent sign, which we've assigned the value raja to. For some reason, it seems to usually be the juncture sign that occurs with those two signs. It never occurs with the diamond chevron sign, pati, but it does occur sometimes with the spoked wheel sign, deva. But so do the other two juncture signs. So the distribution of these three signs with respect to those interesting signs is probably a telling clue that if I'd thought about it a little more deeply, I could have, maybe it would have more to say about it. But let's see what I do have to say. So as I said, these signs appear to have a related function. They do for the most part, and emphasis on for the most part. There are exceptions to this. Occasionally the first and second of these two signs actually occur together. So that's an interesting fact. But for the most part, they occur in complementary distribution, which means they occur in the same environment, but never together, or very seldom. Okay, so here you can see where they occur. Occasionally they occur as the final element as an inscription, as with the common standalone inscription, the diamond chevron sign plus the double tick. That is an inscription unto itself. And that fact, as we learned very early on in the lectures, I think way back in lecture 3, was a very significant clue as to the general nature of this sign. It taught us, in effect, that this sign has to denote a lexeme and thus is some kind of a logograph and not a simple syllable sign, despite how common this sign is. Okay, and as I noted, these three signs do not have the same patterns of distribution with respect to these various P signs. All right, so the diamond chevron sign, as it turns out, only occurs with this one, whereas this sign here, deva, can co-occur with any of the three signs. These three here, rajan, sri, and vasu, usually co-occur with this one, and never co-occur with this one, but do occasionally occur with this one, the single tick sign. And as I mentioned, this sign does seem to have a slightly different status. Perhaps it is unmarked, as we say in linguistics, with respect to the other two, meaning it has a simpler, more general meaning in some sense, because you do see it sometimes occurring together with those signs in the juncture position. All right. I'm not sure I've tabulated that or not. I guess I have. Okay, so here's some data, and you'll see here. So we see, for example, the single tick sign occurs only once with Shri, twice with Vasu, once with Raja, but 14 times with Deva, 4 times with Patini, and 6 times with Pati plus this thing. So here's some examples where it occurs following another juncture sign, 3 times with Deva plus double tick sign, and there are 15 total occurrences of the single tick occurring together with the double tick. All right, so I'm putting this data forth primarily for those of you who want to dig into this further. This is all taken from Mahadevan, by the way. The ICAT might well have additional instances of this, but anyway, this gives you the general idea of some of the patterns that these signs use. And this is one of the major outstanding questions of the decipherment, which is, what do these 3 very common signs actually mean? All right. Now, the double tick sign occurs, at least in Mahadevan, occurs 295 times. This is the most common pairing of any sign pairs in the corpus. Okay. It occurs 8 times with the compound sign Shri Pati. It occurs 10 times with Shri Pati Deva, excuse me. It occurs 7 times with Raja, so there's an example there, and 83 times with Deva, so very common also with the spoked wheel sign. And then finally in the bottom, you can see that it occurs a lot with Shri, a lot with Vasu, and a lot with Raja, 55 times with Raja, but also 24 times with Deva. It never occurs with Pati, but it does occur twice with Patini. So that's perhaps also a significant fact that at some point I'll have to think about and see if I can make anything of it. But that's the data. All right. Oh, and before we go on to the next thing, so the question is, what does this data mean? The most common supposition about these 3 signs is that they represent case endings of some sort. Now, I kind of doubt that, although maybe the single tick sign is some sort of a case ending. But the reason I doubt it is because I don't see any evidence anywhere else that case endings occur. They seem to be associated with a particular type of sign or sign field in a particular case, and a case meaning situation, i.e. P fields or signs that can serve in P fields. So, at a very, very tentative guess, I would suggest that these signs more likely have to do with honorifics, or perhaps they're benefactive in some sense. They mean for the sake of, or for, or some such. But even though this language, if it is Indo-Aryan, as I'm claiming, or even if it's not, even if it's Dravidian, it would have presumably had case endings in the language itself. That does not necessarily mean that those case endings were represented in the writing system. Early forms of cuneiform, for instance, frequently did not represent all the inflectional information, this sort of thing. The purpose of writing in its earliest form, often tends to be more in the sense of we have to get the basic idea across. We have to communicate it with maximum economy of space, because writing is pretty laborious if you're carving it on the surface of steatite, or if you're putting it on clay tablets and inscribing it with these little styli that people use to create the very complex cuneiform signs and this kind of thing. It was much more laborious than writing is today. And so, there often was this inclination toward economy of space and usage, and to say, in effect, there's no need to write down every single little jot and tittle of the language if it's pretty clear already that you're dealing with such and such a word, and this is the relationship between them. So we need not suppose that these scribes, whoever they were, these Harappan scribes, used a system that reproduced all aspects of words, and one of those aspects, of course, would have been case endings. Is it really necessary to reproduce them in written form, particularly if your major medium is so limited, spatially limited, as the surface of these tiny seals and things like this, right? Obviously, if writing develops to the point where you're using it on parchment and papyrus and other types of environments where space is not such a concern, then there tends to be this sense of, well, now that we're using this for something other than just recording transactions and names and things of this nature, perhaps we should try to reproduce more faithfully all of the, the inflectional, the morphosyntactic information encoded in the language so that it's maximally clear. All right, so I just want to point that out. I don't think personally that these are case endings, because neither these nor another class of signs, the terminal signs, which are sometimes also suggested as case endings, really seem to be that. But we'll see what the data says. There are other possibilities. I mentioned honorifics. I mentioned benefactive signs, for the sake of, or for such and such. There's also gender markers, number markers, singular, dual, plural. The fact that there are three of these signs and there were three numbers in Indo-Aryan, early Indo-Aryan, and in Indo-European generally, the singular, the dual, and the plural, is perhaps significant. And there was a time when I pretty much thought that's what we were dealing with. But again, why would you have a sign to mark the singular? It doesn't really make sense. So maybe they mark the double tick and the long double tick sign represent the dual and the plural or some such. I don't know, but it still doesn't. My intuition is it's probably not the full explanation, and it's risky imposing latter-day biases on how writing is supposed to work on writing from so long ago. This is one of the great challenges of deciphering very old scripts. And this was not a challenge so much, for example, for James Prinsep, the man who deciphered the Brahmi script and the Kharoshthi script of early historical South Asia, because those scripts essentially worked similar to other scripts of their time. They were kind of Abugida scripts, or if you will, alpha syllabic scripts, similar in the way they represented language to not only to subsequent scripts like the Devanagari script and the Tamil script in South Asia, but also to other scripts of approximately the same time and place from elsewhere in the world. So they, so he didn't really have to say, well, are these scripts doing something entirely different and weird and revolutionary? It was pretty clear that they weren't. The main problem was figuring out what they say. And something similar could be said about, for example, the writing in the Voynich manuscript, which, whatever else it may appear, it appears to be something like an alphabet. Yes, or similar. It's not the problem is no one has any idea what the language is or even the provenience of the text itself. It's very, very curious. So that's an interesting and enduring mystery. But the actual working of the script itself does not seem to be all that mysterious. But in this case, reaching this far back in time, we're confronting a problem similar to what Young and Champollion and others confronted Sacy when they were looking at the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Is they're looking at a writing system that does stuff that writing systems really don't do anymore. Even though we mentioned modern Chinese as being similarly a logographic script, but the principle of logography is rather different in Chinese than in a hieroglyphic. So it's kind of like an entire branch of study. The same with the cuneiform. And cuneiform writing has many different forms, representing different and in some cases unrelated languages, and varying greatly in the number of signs. So this is something that needs to be borne in mind. And so I just as a kind of a friendly caution to those of you who are of the opinion that this is essentially the ancestor to the Brahmi script and works on the same principle. There are people that have made this claim. That really doesn't seem very likely at all, particularly based on the time depth, the difference in time. This script cropped up probably more than 2 millennia before Brahmi ever appeared. So it's and the patterns of occurrence of the sign just it doesn't. There may be some incidental graphological similarities, but there's nothing about the patterning of these signs suggests that this script in any way works the same way as Brahmi. All right, let's continue on to another interesting sign. I didn't mention this in the introduction, but here it is. And this is the sign that we kind of looked at the beginning, and then we haven't had much to say about it since. But it turns out this sign is decipherable. It's kind of cool. This little sign that looks kind of like a vessel, like a U, which occurs alongside certain long stroke numerals, and it's usually on a different face of the artifact from the rest of the inscription, and oftentimes just kind of scratched into it, rather than something that was created, in relief to be part of the seal. So it seems to record some sort of event or something independent of the inscription in the seal. And occasionally, as we noted, the fish grapheme and the Bowman sign, Dana, also occur in these contexts. So the next slide will just show a few examples of, we'll call it the U sign for want of a better term, with various long stroke numerals. Okay. Again, when it says line 2, it means that it's found normally on a different side of the object, usually the back side. So usually these are two-sided seals or tablets, and on one side you have the main inscription, and the other side you have this thing, which again oftentimes appears as a separate entity inscribed on it subsequent to the creation of the artifact in question. All right. So here's an example of it with the fish. Here's another fish. Here with the fish and the bow sign, as well as a stroke numeral, and so forth. Up to 4, and it's rather limited. Usually it's 2, 3, or 4 strokes, but not 5, 6, 7, or any of the small stroke numerals like the 12 stroke, small stroke numeral. Those never occur with this sign. All right, so this is somewhat mystifying. And again, as we mentioned in the early going, I believe way back in lecture 3, this has all the aspects of some kind of mensuration, something metrological. But with that said, quite different from, for example, an M field like the one we see here on this inscription, or here on this inscription, or here in this inscription. It seems to have an entirely different purport. But as it turns out, there are some instances where this sign occurs in other contexts, where it actually occurs in P fields and C fields and so forth. And so, and this is the reading that was suggested by these. And I'll show you this first, and then we'll go on from there. The reading that was suggested is similar in spirit, I guess, to the reading for Pala Pala. Only this time it's Charu Charu. All right. Now, the The former word, charu, refers to oblation or offering, which was off, and it also refers to the receptacle, a large bowl in which this offering was boiled. Okay, it's called the charu. It's a vessel, all right, as we mentioned here. And the latter form, charu, means deer, and it's cognate, deer as in D-E-A-R, not the animal. And it's cognate with Latin carus, French share, Italian caro, and even Spanish caro, although in modern Spanish caro usually means expensive rather than dear. But that's where the word comes from. Okay, so this is another good Indo-European word. And the interesting thing, it was also a compound in given names, like charu deva, dear God or dear Lord, all right? And you can see a few examples of this in the next sign here. So this is, so you can see, let's see, charuka, an attested name right there, followed by a T sign, which we've not talked about. I don't have a reading for this sign. That's another task for another day. Here's charu by itself, and this, followed by the asti character that we'll talk about later, which means property, property of charu. Again, a well-attested name, another example. And then here's charu deva, which occurs a couple times as well. Now, admittedly, there's not a lot of instances of this sign occurring outside of these funny inscriptions. But here's the hypothesis I'm suggesting, and I think it's a pretty good one. I think that those funny little inscriptions with the vertical lines represent a record of a charu, of a sacrifice. All right, and probably the strokes represent the number of times that it was performed, or some such. And this is not at all, this isn't bizarre in any sense, because so-called donative inscriptions that record sacrifices, are a very, very prominent feature of South Asian culture. So much so that they're prominent not only in proto-historical and historical India, Hindu religion, but also with Jainism and with Buddhism as well. And they were recorded on potsherds, they were recorded on temple walls, they were recorded on stones, on all kinds of objects, and clearly were regarded as something that needed to be recorded for posterity. All right, so these are called donative inscriptions, and there's a literature on them, and they are, I won't say they're never found in other cultures, but they're a very, very, very important feature of South Asian culture. And so what we're proposing is that these are a type of donative inscription, that they're recording a particular votive act, and that act being the charu, and that this sign has another value, charu, that occasionally crops up in other contexts, as we see here. Make of that what you will, but that is the proposed value for this sign. And I think given everything else that we've seen and what we've learned about the inscriptions, this squares very well with the data that we have. All right. So yeah, here it is as a record of charu oblations, just a few examples. So, this inscription seems to mean something like, Sahapati, Lord of the world of men. I mentioned that already. It's a name of Brahma, by the way. And so if we're correct in saying this is actually some sort of a benefactive or sign, if it means for the sake of or unto or for or some such thing, we could read this as saying, 4 charus done for this person. I don't know. That's a possibility. And similarly for the second one. So anyway, I think more research is needed here, but I thought this hypothesis was on strong enough ground that it was worth mentioning. It is also discussed at length in my monograph. All right, so let's go on to the T field, the mysterious jar sign and arrow sign, two of the commonest and most conspicuous signs in the Harappan signary, and certainly in the corpus. So these are like the fish signs. These are signs that anyone who's spent any time kind of looking at this problem knows about these two signs. They've seen them, and they kind of jump out at you. Now the jar sign are often assumed to be affixes like noun case markers because they so frequently occur in leftmost or absolute final position in words. However, and this is what I assumed for many, many years, but eventually I kind of overcame this just by I was forced to a different conclusion by the preponderance of the data. So let's look at that. So here's a problem. These two signs frequently occur to the left of sign sequences like fish and oval clusters that demonstrably represent multiple coordinated lexemes. such as in the underlined sequences. Okay, and these two examples right here. Okay, so if these represent grammatical affixes, like gender markers or case endings, why would they occur only singly in such contexts, i.e. instead of occurring separately and discretely with each lexeme to be marked with a given grammatical feature? I'm not saying it couldn't be done, it might have been some sort of a conventionalized shorthand, but it seems a little bit odd, right, if these are case markers, because clearly here we have 3 different coordinated entities, and here we have 2. Okay, and so why would there be only one case sign corresponding to them? Right, this is a fairly common pattern, particularly with the spear or arrow sign, whatever this thing is. All right. Now, another interesting thing worth observing is that the jar sign, as it's called, this sign, has several other forms which are akin in graphology, but they do differ strikingly in distribution, although from the naked jar sign, but not from one another. They have 1, 2, or 3 ticks, or a couple that have more than 3 ticks, but these are the 3 basic forms. Okay, and you've seen them already, and if you were listening carefully to several of my lectures, including this one, you already know what my interpretation of it is, but I'm going to give you the rationalization for it now, the rationale. So these 3 signs are frequently found in rightmost position, meaning at the very beginning of an inscription, or elsewhere in the P field environment rather than in T fields. So they're never found in T fields. And if they are derived in some way from this, it's hard to imagine how a sign representing a grammatical affix, if affix it be, can have modified versions occurring in the initial or prefix environment. I mean, maybe there's an explanation under those contexts, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. If this is, let's say, a genitive case marker, which some people have suggested it to be, or even a nominative case marker or something like that, well, then what are these? Okay. Well, number 3. And by the way, we'll answer that question in a minute, but first we're looking at some reasons to doubt that these signs are in fact, affixes. So if we interpret the jar sign and other analogous terminal signs as grammatical affixes, it would suggest a very well-developed system of affix marking as against a comparatively impoverished logosyllabary. However, the Harappan signary is comparatively lacking in signs that occur both frequently and randomly, suggesting a paucity of simple phonograms. This is precisely the reverse of what we would expect for a script with a supposedly well-developed system for representing case affixes, given that ancient writing like Proto-Cuneiform and early Maya only began representing grammatical affixing well after the initial invention of writing and the creation of complete signaries. So the point of this, I guess I can distill this into simpler language. What this means is that if these are case markings, then that would mean that we have pretty much a fully fleshed out writing system. But that's not really what this writing system looks like. If you've noticed, and we've not really looked at all of the signs, but we don't see, for example, a lot of simple syllable signs. We see a lot of logograms. And the weird frequency that they appear with is now, of course, explained by the fact that they're occurring repetitively in names and titles. Logograms like pati and pala are occurring with, you would say, almost unnatural frequency, but that's because of the skewed and unnatural nature of the database. We're not dealing with a corpus of, let's say, newspaper clippings or long or lengthy sacred texts or something like that would be expected to give a more random sampling of the language. Instead, we're dealing with something that's highly restricted and stylized and limited, because in the creation of compound names in South Asia, there are just certain terms that are not used, and then there are certain terms that very commonly are used, like pala, like pati, like sena, like deva, and so forth and so on, that just crop up again and again for some reason by convention. But looking at the writing system overall, it's hard to resist the impression, particularly given the paucity of actual inscribed objects. We don't see writing on walls, for example, longer inscriptions on walls. The longest such inscription that we kind of have is the Dolavira signboard, but we found precious little of that. Doesn't mean that stuff didn't exist, that there wasn't writing on palm fronds or birch bark or something like that, perishables that all disappeared. Maybe that's true. But the evidence available seems to suggest that this writing system is like all writing systems in their early stages of development, certainly in the Bronze Age, is really kind of basic and designed for, as I said before, maximal economy of expression. Whereas if it has a fully fleshed out system for representing case endings, that would suggest that we have a full writing system, like an alphabet or a modern syllabary or something like that. So anyway, that's the point of that argument. All right. So the proposition that I eventually arrived at, and this might seem very counterintuitive to a lot of you, is that T signs, such as the jar sign and the other sign that looks like an arrow, are most likely predicates, specifically common predicates associated with assets, belonging, and valuation. And as predicates, I would add, basically just represent the root. Verbs, like nouns, have in Indo-Aryan very complex inflectional systems, and also in Dravidian for that matter, complex systems of endings associated with them. None of that is evident here. Okay, because I think, at least in the context that we see here, these spatially very limited contexts, they didn't want to go to the trouble to literally spell out all of these words. But, a word in, a verb in Indo-Aryan agrees in person and number, and there are, learning. I mean, the Sanskrit verb was once described by an eminent philologist as the eighth wonder of the world, or maybe it was the ancient Greek verb. I don't know. But anyway, the verb systems found in early Indo-European are just astonishingly luxuriant and complex and difficult to learn. And so what they seem to have done instead is simply represented the predicate by a single sign. And in my opinion, the most likely value for the jar sign is just the root us, which is the root for to be, which may represent various inflected values, as we see here, asti, santi, and so forth. Asti means is, third person singular, santi is plural. And actually, it's asti is a very distant cognate to the English word is, and German ist, but that's another story. Santi, those of you who know Romance languages and Latin may say, well, that kind of looks like Latin sunt, or Spanish son, or French son, right? And that's because, again, it is a cognate form. One of the things one finds in historical linguistics is that these very basic common verbs, like be and go and so forth, tend to be very stable over time and tend to be much less susceptible to change. And so one of the ways of establishing whether one language A is related genetically to language B is to look, if it has an explicit copula, which is what this type of verb is called, and not all languages do, by the way, but if it does, to compare them and see if there are similarities, and so that's what you're seeing here. Okay, so in my view, that's what the naked jar sign means. It just represents the predicate be, because in South Asia. In South Asian languages, the normal way of talking about ownership, they don't have a word meaning belong. They just say X is to Y. So for example, I could say, to me are 3 kilos or something like that. That's the way it's normally done. And actually, even in English, we have something a little bit similar to that, where we say, well, this book is mine, instead of saying this book belongs to me. All right. So that's kind of in the same vein, but that's the normal way of expressing possession in South Asia, possession or ownership. All right. So I'm suggesting that owing to the extreme compression of form required by the seals and other Indo-source materials, this predicate and others like it, by the way, is indicated only by a root sign, as it were, which may not convey all phonetic information, but which does supply sufficient information for interpretation. All right. And so the root us in Sanskrit, as already mentioned, can mean belong to, be, or belong to. And so you can see there how that works under number 1. But number 2 can also mean is, equal, or equivalent to. And that's another attested use of the root us. So there are actually 2 roots for be in Sanskrit. The other is bhu, or bhavati, and so forth. And they're the source of the word be in English. So that if you've ever wondered why we have be versus is, the reason is that represents a conflation of the 2 different Indo-European root words for be. Now, bhu oftentimes has more of a meaning of to become or to be in a situation or something like that. They're not exactly the same. Us is more the pure copular use of this verb. Now, the most likely value for the arrow sign I propose to be ish. Again, the root ish means be accepted or regarding as, be worth. And so another expected predicate in the context of such inscriptions. Again, I talk about this in much greater detail in the monograph. And so, if you want more kind of justification for this, you can look at that. But it's an expected predicate in the content of inscriptions that clearly do have notations of assets and transactions and things like this. Good for such and such amount, that kind of thing. That's a typo. That should say "an" rather than "and." But anyway, and in part by the near homonym status of the most common Vedic Sanskrit word for arrow, which is ishu, by the way. And there is another possible value, which is the near homonym ish, which means to own or possess. So it could mean so-and-so owns such and such an amount as well. But either way, I think that's the approximate value of this sign, which varies, only once or twice occurs outside of, well, maybe once or twice, a handful of times outside of the terminal environment, the T sign environment. Okay, but now here's a kicker. So these three signs that look like the jar sign but with ticks inside it, in my view, are most likely nominalized forms of the verb as. Now, by nominalize, I mean basically a noun form. Nominalization is a very common, indeed indispensable, grammatical process whereby verbs, and sometimes adjectives as well, are transformed into nouns. So, for example, transform becomes transformation. So tacking on ation is in English, is a very productive way of nominalizing a verb. Sometimes adding ing is nominalized. And sometimes just the verb itself, like the word help, depending on the context, can be a noun or verb. So sometimes a nominalization can take place without any kinds of morphological modification. So, but in either case, in Sanskrit, the modified form of the verb as is asti, which meant, remember it's found in suastika, by the way. It can mean being but it can also mean property or assets. And it's also found in most, if not all, modern Indian languages in this form. So both Hindi and Tamil use the word asti to mean property or assets. The Sanskrit word astimat means having property. Mat is a common possessive affix, meaning having or being possessed of. All right. So in my view, this is the reason. I think that these are just nominalizations and they mean property coming from this root as. All right. So, I mean, if someone has a better hypothesis, I'd love to hear it. But this fits very nicely with the data, and again, these three signs do occur in circumstances where you say, well, they might have something to do with assets, but they're clearly not the same as the M signs in the M field. Anyway, all right. Well, that takes us to the end of this lecture, and the next lecture, lecture 10, will be the final lecture. It will we're going to put this all together and say, broadly speaking, what do these inscriptions actually mean? What are we talking about when we're talking about, P fields that have various titles and honorifics and names in conjunction with, M fields that are clearly notations of assets of some sort, but then also sometimes a C field that seems to have an additional name. And what do they tell us about Indus culture? Well, we're not going to be able to learn as much about Indus culture as Champollion could learn when he started reading the hieroglyphs, because the corpus is so much smaller and more limited. But still, we're going to learn a lot, and you're going to learn a lot about Indus culture that up until now was obscure, that no one knew about, that we can infer from some of these names and other features of the seals and inscriptions.